I want you to think about this. The only thing that drives meaningful shifts in platform market share are paradigm shifts.
What though, if the mission statement were the moonshot all along? What if I'm feeling lucky were not a whimsical button on a Spartan homepage, but the default way of interacting with all of the world's information? What if an AI assistant were so good and so natural that anyone with seamless access to it simply used it all the time, without thought? That, needless to say, is probably the only thing that truly scares Apple. Yes, Android has its advantages to iOS, but they aren't particularly meaningful to most people. And even for those that care, like me, they are not large enough to give up on iOS's overall superior user experience. The only thing that drives meaningful shifts in platform market share are paradigm shifts. The fact that Google is being mocked mercilessly for messed up AI answers gets at why consumer-facing AI may be disruptive for the company. The reason why incumbents find it hard to respond to disruptive technologies is because they are, at least in the beginning, not good enough for the incumbent's core offering.
The exception, of course, is Apple, right? From the Apple II to the Mac was one paradigm shift, the graphical user interface. From the Mac to the phone, well, that was the mobile paradigm shift. Now, Apple lost the Mac versus PC battle because developers immediately saw IBM as a winner, and so they started making apps for IBM PCs. And then it became a self-perpetuating cycle. Developers saw the IBM PC as going to be successful, so they developed for it, which made it more successful, and that is the nature of a platform flywheel. If you win the paradigm shift, then you basically win the entire platform market, or at least a good portion of it. Well, Apple learned their lesson and they won the iPhone battle because developers saw the iPhone as an immediate hit, right? They had built up this goodwill with consumers because they had released hit product after hit product after hit product, the iMac, the iPhone, the MacBook Air, all of those in a successive, set of releases, buying all this goodwill and ultimately proving to developers that they can make a mass market product, and therefore that developers should build for the platform, right? So they won the iPhone battle by making the App Store the ultimate killer app for the iPhone. And remember, at the beginning, the original developer story for the iPhone was the web, but developers wanted to make something for it so bad because, number one, they were passionate Mac-loving developers that knew how to build for that type and style of platform and the technologies that underlaid it. But more importantly, that they saw it as an economic winner from the get-go. Now, it's important to remember that products become platforms by empowering developers, right? They draw them in and then they empower them and they give them the opportunity to make something greater and give them the opportunity to build superhuman interfaces. That's what great platforms do. So the question today is, how is Apple going to confront what is another potentially paradigm-shifting technology in AI? And do they still have what it takes to be the exception that proves the rule? Let's start by unpacking the iPhone, right? If that was an important paradigm shift from the desktop to mobile, then we can learn some lessons about what a paradigm shift means, kind of when it comes to a user interface perspective, right? Less from a market perspective right now. So superhuman interface, it amplifies relatively small amount of human input and creates a relatively large amount of output as a result. And this is what Steve Jobs meant when he said that computers were a bicycle for the mind. The way that Apple solved the problem of moving from a very high resolution input device on the Mac to a very not very low, but relatively low resolution input device with the finger on the phone is by continuing the use of the paradigm of apps and making the phone a highly contextual system, right? The iPhone does that. It provides context by breaking the system into apps, right? Really, this concept came from the idea of the multitasking PC, right? But it kind of brought it to its fullest extent where the phone wasn't fully an expression of an app, one app at a time, at any given moment. And so it provided a lot of context based off of where you were in the app, what app you had open, and a touch at 150, 276 in terms of the grid meant different things depending on what that context was. Importantly, the context was shown to the human, right? And the human could use the affordances, use the signifiers in order to make a decision about what they wanted to do on the screen, use their low resolution input device, and receive a superhuman effect in the end. It seems trivial, I know. It seems very trivial for me to say all of this when it comes to the graphical user interface, but it isn't as trivial when it comes to text, right? When it comes to a AI LLM type based user interface, because with a raw LLM, you end up having to provide a lot, the user, have to provide a lot of that context, which a developer or a designer would before. It's almost reversing the roles if you're using a raw LLM. It would be like asking a user to code, right? If every person in the world had to code in order to use their phone, well, they wouldn't be using their phones as a computer. They would still be using a flip phone. Putting the onus of design onto users is usually a really bad thing because it asks the user to have a very good understanding of the realities of the system rather than the usage of that system towards some end goal. Remember, users don't buy computers, they buy apps, right? That's why killer apps are a thing in the first place. And so that is why you end up with this set of graphs. If you take a look at what we've talked about with LLMs, we know that in a low context scenario, you end up with something that looks like this. An X and a Y axis. This is the prompt length, and this is the precision of the output. Kind of the input-output alignment is one way to think about it. Does the thing do what I want it to do when I touch it, or when I ask it to do something? Well, with a very low prompt length, you're going to end up with very low precision when it comes to LLMs. With a longer prompt length specified well, you're going to end up with higher precision. You go up and to the right, just like this. All right, let's take a look at a high context scenario. For the most part, it's actually very similar. You still receive an increase the longer the prompt length is, right? But in this case, I would argue that with a shorter prompt length, you actually get more bang for your buck. Now, I've talked about this before, and you kind of flatten that curve a little bit, so that way the worst response that you get is still pretty good when you think about the worst case scenario for input resolution, right? These graphs are a little misleading, but I think they're illustrative of the sort of broader idea of what's going on in this system. You want higher context, high quality context scenarios in order to receive good output from the worst case scenario in terms of prompt length. Because I want you to think about this context. This is kind of like a raw LLM. If you're using a raw LLM, the worst case scenario for input resolution on an arbitrary prompt with no additional context is extremely low prompt length and therefore extremely low precision. And so you want to shape your UI using LLMs in a way to reduce the problems involved at the bottom half of that graph. And that's why you provide a higher context scenario. So let's go back to our idea of what an LLM actually looks like. These are kind of helpful rules of thumb, but a better idea of what the system looks like is something like this. You have lots of reference text over here, and all of that reference text, let's see, ref text, is used to train the large language model. Remember, this is the point of why I think a lot of these AI products have not been good, because it is a large language model. It's not modeling the reality, it's not modeling reasoning, it's modeling language in a very helpful way. That's why people say that large language models, or the current crop of AI, is essentially fancy autocorrect or text prediction, because it really is just that. Now, the incredible thing is that if you provide an LLM a little tiny bit of context in the form of a prompt, Well, even just a little bit of context in this scenario is still pretty good for these two things to combine together and provide a relatively good generated output text. Output text. And then guess what? With a chatbot, you can loop this all back, provide that as context, and then as long as you're within a certain range of number of words, guess what? You end up with a relatively good chatbot. It just isn't grounded in reality because guess what? You still have low prompt length and low context and therefore end up with low precision. The goal of a system, when you think about the shape of what a computer actually provides to someone using it, and in particular to a developer, it provides that context to the developer that allows the developer to shape that context in something that's intelligible for a user, something that a user can actually do. And so one way to provide context to this entire system would be to plug it in right here. What if you plugged in the system? And what I mean by the system is all of the functions of a device, all of the hard work of building a operating system over, in the case of Apple, literally decades, in order to get to a point where it has a huge set of very rich capabilities, both built by developers and built by Apple. Well, if you can expose the system to that, guess what happens? You end up with a very powerful combination, more context than was originally provided by the prompt, and importantly, if you're trying to achieve something, a way to actually make it happen. This was the issue with the Humane AI pen. This was the issue with the Rabbit R1. This was the issue, frankly, with Meta's Ray-Ban glasses. It's that none of them are building on top of a platform that already is rich and capable. They're trying to start from ground one, and they're essentially 15 years late to the game. And so what I'd like to do is quickly read you a comment from, this one's from Hello, I'm Eden, I think. This was a comment, I believe, on my original, I think one of my original AI videos. And they said, I think all these points are not only super interesting to the topic you picked, but they could be completely applied, if not word for word, then closely to the way that we are creating AI. I think you summed it down to inputs and outputs, really. And AI creation is pretty much a game of inputs and outputs. So when we talk about good and bad input and outputs, whether that's on the creation of AI or the user side with interaction of AI, I think the issues are aligned in that sense. It relies on good and bad outputs. I think the difference is with creating AI and the use of it will come down to which one is first to need less quality inputs to produce a better quality output. I want to read that part again. I think the difference with creating AI and the use of it will come down to which one is the first to need less quality inputs to produce a better quality output. So in a sense, I think Google, more than OpenAI, are betting that AI and their ability to provide better inputs to create it, well, in the long run, make it so that users can actually provide terrible or no inputs and fundamentally get better results than the need to have good or decent user input, methods, designs, features. But I think we're still a ways away, and that requires you to live in Google's world and let them scan your emails and life away. Well, what if it was Apple providing that, right? What if Apple was providing an ability to give you make the user provide a very small amount of poor quality input and kind of enrich that with all of the functions and power of the developer community that they have harnessed for, I mean, in this case, the last at least 30 years, if not 40 or more, and create the, I'm gonna say it, the most powerful platform for a conversational AI chatbot that exists currently. I really think that we might see, literally in the next day, Apple going from a perception of being behind in AI to being literally absolute number one, because they have used their ability and their taste to craft an AI system in a way that makes sense given the capabilities of the technology, the same way they did for the graphical user interface, and honestly the same way that they did for the personal computer. I'm going to go back to my diagram here and just say that if you look at this part right here, One way to shape AI and make it better is to provide let me put it this way. One way to shape AI interfaces, if we're trying to shape an AI interface to make it usable for a user, around a user's low context input, is to provide a high context environment for that input to be bounced around in. Other good things would include stuff like communicating proactively to the user if something doesn't seem available, or fetching the web for possible options and asking the user for confirmation, citing your sources if you're quoting something from the web so that the user can use their ability to understand kind of credibility in their analysis of what's going on. All of those things would be very useful. Remember, I have said over and over again that large language models are great at translation and summarization. And that's definitely what we're going to see. If those are the two things that LLMs are good at, I bet you, knowing Apple and their commitment to quality, that they will lean into translation and summarization. And by the way, translation includes my ability to speak into the world something that I want to happen into a set of actions that are available for the user based off of what they have downloaded on their device, or maybe even what's just available on the App Store.
And while I doubt the V1 version of Pixie, Google's rumored Pixel-only AI assistant, would be good enough to drive switching from iPhone users, there is at least a path to where it does exactly that.
So this gets us to the point where we talk about challenges. First of all, the most interesting thing at WWDC at the main keynote will be to see, in conjunction with the Apple Vision Pro, in combination, that's one paradigm shift, by the way, in combination with their announcements about AI, another paradigm shift, basically if Apple's still got it, I think it's going to be very, very revealing. I would argue with Apple Vision Pro, it's a pretty good sign that something's going to happen there with AI. But we're going to see a lot, we're going to learn a lot about this company come tomorrow. Here's another issue. The developer community for Apple is frankly souring. I think I saw a study, maybe quoted by Gruber, that said basically 39% of developers, almost half, are unhappy with the App Store. Now, one way to juice numbers to make people happier with frankly, a kind of like top-down autocracy is to make a better platform, to make the environment happier and better. If they make their iPhone even better and even more appealing to more people, well, developers might see that and be happier, at least in the short run, because of the kind of power that is being provided to them. May or may not happen, but that definitely is a risk. If you have pissed off a bunch of developers, well, guess what? You've messed up what could be your biggest asset in terms of competition amongst many others. The last one is one that Ben Thompson talks a lot about, and that is that Google, actually, with their Android platform, is probably the closest competitor in terms of these things. We saw Microsoft release a Windows Copilot plus PC-type branding thing that provided some level of AI interfaces, but I'm not that impressed with it. I mean, Recall was the most impressive feature, and it seems like Recall is not going over very well ultimately, and frankly, it's a very niche thing that it will probably become very useful over time, but at the beginning is kind of just meh, in my opinion. Android, on the other hand, well, I guess if you could talk about Meta is very far off with Oculus. I don't think it's like mainstream enough for it to even be considered. So that means that Android and Google in particular have a very strong possible case here, and this is what Thompson talks about. They have a completely vertically integrated Android phone already, the Pixel, right? They also have a completely vertically integrated stack for AI. And so combining all of those things is something that might be in the cards for Google as a company right now. In fact, it seems like they might have reorganized Google to orient everything in the same direction there, which would be kind of the ultimate competition for Apple. And it would put Apple in a very interesting position of being the competitor that is not fully integrated, at least in the meantime. I mean, for all we know, Apple is not going to be powering the most complex tasks with their own language model. They're going to use OpenAI's. And so what that means is that suddenly you have another competition in the smartphone area. Because smartphones are likely going to be the device that harnesses the power of AI for consumers in the short run, well, it kind of follows that the two biggest smartphone powers are going to be the ones duking it out, especially when one of them is behind and has the superior technology when it like in-house when it comes to the paradigm shifting technology, and the other one is the incumbent and the current winner who has a long history of design chops and winning platform shifts, at least over the long run. I think we're in for a very exciting time and another set of series of shifting powers and advances that we haven't seen in a long time, and it's taken me until this point to realize just how close it actually is. So I know Bill Gates beat me to the punch. Imagine that.